Antes de comenzar con la jornada académica, les quiero recordar y contarles a quienes no saben que los sábados a las 9:30 de la mañana pueden sintonizar el programa de la Superintendencia de Industria y Comercio SIC TV por el canal Institucional. No se olviden sintonizarnos este sábado, este 5 de septiembre, podrán ver el reporte de este evento. También los invito a que nos sigan en nuestras redes sociales. En Facebook estamos como Superintendencia de Industria y Comercio y en Twitter como @SICSuper. Y cualquier comentario, cualquier post que hagan del Congreso nos pueden mencionar usando el hashtag Consumo Seguro. Damos inicio entonces a esta jornada académica invitando a la doctora Carol Pollack Nelson, psicóloga de factores humanos especializada en seguridad de productos de consumo. Actualmente, su trabajo se centra en la evaluación de la seguridad de los diseños de producto, como de las advertencias e instrucciones. Ha sido merecedora de múltiples reconocimientos, tales como el Premio del Consumidor de la ASTM, entre otros. Ella nos hablará de los factores humanos que se deben tener en cuenta para participar y valorar los riesgos de los productos. Recibámosla, por favor, con un fuerte aplauso.
Psychologists who are interested in productivity, making sure that the interaction between the consumer and the product is productive and efficient. That's very important, but it's not important to me. Another area that people specialize in is aesthetics, making sure that consumers will enjoy using the consumer product. And as you can imagine, that's very, very important as well because of the internet and people writing reviews of consumer products. So it's very important that products get good reviews and that consumers like the product and they talk well about it and they want to repurchase it themselves. So a very, very important area that's not important to me. The only thing that's important to me is safety. And that's, in other words, that the consumer will walk away from using the product with all the same body parts in the same order as when they approach that product. So that's what we're here to talk about today, is how does human factors psychology help with that? Now, there are a number of different objectives of a human factors analysis, and I'm going to only talk to you about some of them today. One of the key objectives is to understand how will a consumer interact with the product, how will they use it, and how will they respond to the product. And that actually means a number of different things. One thing it means is we have to understand who are the foreseeable users of the product. And in some cases, that means unintended users. So we have to be concerned if there's an adult product that is very attractive to children. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And nowadays, we also have to worry if there are certain products that can be dangerous to seniors and people with dementia. And this is something that we're exploring in the United States for certain products, where we are seeing similar hazard patterns for seniors with dementia as we are for children. Another question we ask ourselves is, what are the intended and reasonable unintended uses of a product? Now, we can't really focus on gross misuse, but we can consider what are some of the reasonable misuses, the reasonable ways somebody will misuse a product. For example, a chair. A chair, you're supposed to sit in a chair. How many people have stood on a chair to reach something? We've all done that. That's a reasonable misuse of the product. This may not be a reasonable misuse of the mattresses, however. So we can't think about unreasonable misuse, but we do have to protect against accidents and injuries that can happen from reasonable misuse. Whoops. Another thing we want to know is, what are the reasons for misuse? It's important to understand what motivates human behavior if we want to try and figure out what is the best strategy for preventing the misuse. In addition to understanding how consumers will use a product, we also want to identify hazardous components and procedures. And by procedures, I'm talking about instructions or protocols for using the product that may lead someone towards erroneous use. One of the ways that we approach, as a human factor psychologist, we approach the question, how will somebody use the product, is to do what's called a behavioral task analysis. In a behavioral task analysis, you're taking the use behavior and you're breaking it down into all the different phases of use. So this was my son many years ago, one of my sons. So we consider all the steps of use. We consider assembly, we consider product use, cleaning and troubleshooting, and we also consider how the consumer will leave the product. That includes disassembly, storage, and turning off the product. And we'll talk about that, and you'll see that there are implications for safety associated with how a product is left. I want to start at the beginning. The first thing, assembly. Here's a picture of instruction manuals in a kitchen drawer. That's where I keep my instruction manuals. There are some products that I never even open the instruction manual for. And these are products that you don't assemble, products like your appliances at home. But there are actually some products that you get that require assembly. They require you to assemble them. Every product you get from IKEA. You have IKEA here? No, okay. Well, some furniture you have to assemble, or some products that require assembly. And the way that we have learned in the United States that a lot of people assemble products is intuitively. Do you understand what I mean by intuitively? Okay. And when we assemble products intuitively, it can lead to problems. So we have to think about how can we guide intuitive assembly. The best way to guide intuitive assembly is to utilize what people are going to rely on, and that's sensory feedback. Ideally, well, we know that consumers rely on their senses to guide assembly. We all do this. We are also very heavily reliant on our visual sense, but not only our visual sense, we also rely on tactile and auditory senses. So think about it, when you're assembling a product, you are looking to see, you know, I'm screwing it in. Does it look like it's in place? Yes, but sometimes it's such a minute little attachment, you can't really visually tell if it's in place. So what you're doing is you're listening. Did it click into place? You know, did I feel it snap into place? And so that's, we rely very heavily on our senses. So it's helpful when a product is being designed for it to provide overlapping and redundant sensory cues, especially if the visual cue is limited. The main thing is we don't want products to present erroneous or false cues indicating something is properly assembled when in fact it's not. So here's an example of a ladder. This ladder was recalled, and this is just one example I'm giving you because there are a number of recalls on the CPSC website that are because of erroneous cues during assembly that led to problems. With this ladder, this is one of those ladders that can go in a million different positions. It can be straight, it can be A-frame like it is there, it can be scaffold like that. And when people are putting this ladder into different positions, they grab the area above those hinges. You see those hinges there? They grab the area above that and they press something in, and then they would rotate the top part of the ladder that they're trying to move. And when they were rotating it, they could hear clack, 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 and then it would latch into place. So when people were putting this ladder into the A-frame position, they'd rotate it and they'd hear clack, 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 and then it would stop making noise and it would sound like the hinges were fully seated, like they were latched into place. And people would look at it and they'd say, it looks like it's straight legs, and I heard it, and I felt it. And then what they would do is they'd climb on the first step and they'd be fine. And they'd climb on the second step and they'd be fine. And even the third step, but they got to the fourth step and it would collapse. And they would suffer bad back and head injuries. And the reason is because with the hinge was like this, and the component, instead of being all the way in, was like this. And so when they would step on it, it would slip out. So it sounded, to them, all of their sensory feedback said this thing is set up properly, but in fact it wasn't. And so the product was recalled. Another thing when it comes to assembly is it's very, very, very important that if product components are interchangeable, this should not present a hazard. Okay? And this is an example I'm going to talk about. If components are interchangeable, you have to know if this leads to a critical error. And any components that should not be interchanged should be designed so that they cannot be interchanged. This is an example of a crib that was recalled a long time ago. And you can see that the crib is designed, it's white metal tubular slats, right? Everything is tubular slats. So you have 2 long sides and 2 short sides. And you also have that bottom platform that the mattress is going to sit on. The 2 long sides and the bottom mattress platform have the slats, originally had the slats the same distance apart. The CPSC requires that crib slats cannot be more than 2 3/8 of an inch apart. And the reason for this is because in the old days, when the slats were wider than that, infants would slip through the railings feet first, and they would slide all the way through and get caught up at the head and neck. And so the requirement for 2 3/8 of an inch prevents that, because when they go through feet first, they get stopped at their buttocks. The lower torso stops them, so they can't have that. So it's very, very important that the railings not exceed 2 3/8 of an inch distance. To save some money, the company, over time, for the bottom platform, decided to remove every other railing, or whatever you call it, slat. And so there was 5 inches of space for the bottom platform. But sleepy parents, all they see is white tubes, you know, on white slats everywhere. And so some people mistakenly put the bottom platform on the side. Well, that creates a very critical error. And this product was recalled for that reason. So again, the main thing is you cannot have products that are interchangeable if they shouldn't be interchangeable, components. Okay, so I'm sorry you don't have IKEA, so my IKEA jokes are really not funny, I guess. But with IKEA, everything gets assembled. It's wonderful. I have these products in my home. So I said that consumers many times do not rely, they won't necessarily read all the instructions, but sometimes they have to. Sometimes they have to pull out the instructions. IKEA products are a perfect example of that. You are getting nowhere without reading those instructions. So there's a whole lecture about instructions that I don't have time to do, but I want to just tell you a couple things about instructions that are very important. One thing is, we always want to consider the readability of the text. And you're thinking, well, that's pretty obvious. I'm being a little bit more specific than that. We have computer programs that allow us to understand what grade level, what education level is required in order to understand the text. And we shoot for 7th grade or lower. I don't know what that is in Columbia. It's about the same. So you want to make sure that you are not exceeding the reading capability and the education level of those you're targeting. Another thing is, you want to make sure that the very front of the instructions show all of the components and that they're all identified. And the reason, there are a number of reasons. Number one, you want the consumer to know if they're missing a component. You don't even want them to set that product up if they're missing a component. And number two, it's very important because, again, you don't want them to mistake one type of screw for another type of screw. So identifying all the components up front is important. Also, do the pictures and the words correspond? This might seem very obvious, but I review product instructions for companies that come from overseas, and many times I'm looking at pictures that don't look anything like the product, and I'm looking at words that don't look like the pictures. So that leads to my next point, which is it's very important to have instructions reviewed by a native speaker for whatever country. If it's coming here, someone from this country should be reviewing those instructions. So now I want to talk about using the product. Okay, so before we talk about using the product, the first thing we have to talk about is consumers' expectations about products. In the United States, consumers do not expect major problems with their products. They don't expect blades to fly off, and they don't expect their appliances to catch fire. In particular, they are unaware of hazards associated with common household products. And the reason is, at least in the United States, people are expecting, you know, household appliances have been around forever. They're thinking, okay, you have worked the kinks out by now. We should not be having major problems. The other thing is, we know that consumers often expect their products to be safe. And I give talks to consumers often, and when I talk to them, they'll tell me, oh yes, I expect all the products are tested and they're all safe. And I'll ask them, you know, what about all the lawsuits in the United States? That's different. That happens to somebody else. Their products are going to be safe. So these are the expectations, and we need to know what these expectations are. Some other things that we know, and by the way, all of the slides that I've presented here are a summary of two things. One, published research on human behavior, studies that have been done about consumer behavior, and two, reading incident data, tens of thousands of incidents over the years. And this is what these summary slides are showing you. So we know that consumers are efficient. They sometimes overtax their products, and so products need to be designed to withstand reasonable abuse. We know that consumers multitask. They may not watch products consistently for an extended period of time. I cannot tell you, until I got a tea kettle with a whistle, how many tea kettles I burned the bottom of. It's terrible, and there's actually some products where the bottom will melt off because of the composition, so the whistling tea kettle is a big thing for me. So it's very important to build prevention devices into products like automatic shutoffs and whistles. We know that consumers forget to turn things off, not just because they multitask and get distracted, but sometimes they fall asleep, and other times it's because they're thinking, that's what this product should do. I am sleeping with my heater, even though the heater says don't sleep with the heater on, because I'm cold, and that's what my heater is for. So sometimes the instructions or warnings just don't make sense to the consumer, so they disregard them. And again, that's why we build safety devices into products like automatic shutoff devices and timers with alarms. We also know that past experiences guide consumer behavior. Past experience with similar products leads to expectations of how new products function. And the reason is that we get used to certain products, and we don't even think about them when we use them. We have behavioral scripts, like when you drive a car. The same thing when you're using a cooktop appliance, for instance. And so we had some problems with some cooktops. They were flat for two reasons. Number one, the heating elements, when they turned off, would still be very hot, but they wouldn't be red. And consumers were expecting them to be red. And another thing is, the cooktop was flat and built into the top of a counter. And so newspapers would get pushed onto the counter. So we know that we run into potential problems when familiar products function differently than older products, or if they have an interface that is different than an older product. So new designs need to respect consumer habits. This cannot be emphasized enough. We have habits. Or they need to break the script by not letting you do what you normally would do, by impeding those old behaviors. Another thing that we know from the research and from the incident data is that children are often attracted to adult products. Here are some features that appeal to children. Something that looks childlike, that looks like it's saying, come play with me. Products that have responsive features that produce visual or auditory reactions to the child's behavior. The same with products that allow for the imitation of adults. Anybody who has children or who has observed children know that children love to imitate their parents or caregivers. And in fact, there's a whole line of toys that are based on this. The toy vacuum, the toy tool belt, right? The toy kitchen. That's because kids like to do what their parents do. And of course, anything that smells sweet and looks like candy. That's just inviting them to eat it. So utilize child-resistant features whenever possible. We also know something about consumers, about ourselves. We're all consumers, and that is that we are more likely to use safety equipment if it's included. Because if it's not included, the perception is, well, if they really thought it was necessary, they would have included it. And I'm not really going to spend the extra money. I mean, look at these two products. You have a gas fireplace, and the gas fireplaces in the United States until 2015, until this year, the glass fronts on the gas fireplaces were permitted by the voluntary standard to reach 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is 260 Celsius. It's as hot as the inside of an oven on the highest setting. And little children over the years were getting burned on the glass fronts. And industry was aware of this, but for many years resisted on putting a screen on the front. But consumers, not only were they unaware of how hot the glass got, but when they were told at the end of buying an expensive fireplace, hey, do you want this screen? They'd say, no, I don't want this screen for another, $300. I just spent all this money on my gas fireplace. And the same thing we saw happening with trampolines. Now, just so that you know, starting in 2015, gas fireplaces sold in the United States are required to have a mesh screen barrier or some sort of a barrier permanently attached. So now let's talk about cleaning and fixing the product. We know, and again, we are all consumers, we're guilty of this, that when something goes wrong with a product, people stick their fingers in there to try and figure it out. And if they can't do that, they're going to stick a knife in, or they're going to stick some other product into the equipment. So we want to make sure that there are no accessible sharp points or moving components or any live wires that might cause a problem. So a little bit more we want to talk about with troubleshooting and cleaning. You have to ask yourself, is there a practical way to clean or fix the product? And are suitable cleaning products specified? Because consumers are going to use what's handy. I have to give you this example. I have a very expensive new coffee maker, and it says in the instructions that I have to clean it with something I have never heard of, but they were nice enough to tell me how much it would cost to get the cleaner and where to mail in for this cleaner. I am not getting this cleaner. I am going to do a water and vinegar rinse just like everybody else. So I think that, when you can specify products, but you can't make it unreasonable for the consumer to clean it properly. So now I want to talk about disassembly and storage. This is the fourth thing. Here we have an example of a portable pull. And portable pulls are one of those products that says, have fun with this pull, but it's not safe for children to use unattended. And it also says, if you've ever read the instructions on a portable pull, empty the pull after use. What's after use? Do you know how long it takes for that water to heat up? It takes a long time, right? And can you imagine if your children are playing in the pool for an hour or two, and then you go in for lunch? Are you supposed to dump the pool water? It's not good for the environment. Again, it took forever for that pool water to get cleared. Can you imagine the whole neighborhood doing that? You'll be living in a mudslide. There's no way that's reasonable. So this is an example of how the way people leave a product can cause a problem. Not just with children's products. There are a lot of adult products that say, store away from children. Well, here's what that means to the consumer. It means keep it out of the child's reach, and I'm talking direct reach when they're standing on the floor, but keep it in a place that's convenient and practical for you. Storing out of reach does not make a product inaccessible. Let me go back one second. Let me give you an example with lighters. We have regulations, mandatory regulations about barbecue lighters, like the one in this picture, and also cigarette lighters. And the reason we have this regulation is because for many, many years, little children were accessing the lighters, and they were clicking them. And if you think about it, they provide a lot of feedback. Not only does the child get to imitate the parent, but it provides a lot of feedback. You hear the clicking, you create a flame, what could be more fun? And some of the incidents actually happened because the child would get it, and the parent would see that the child had the lighter, and they'd put it behind their back, and they'd light their clothes on fire. Other times, the kids would access the lighter, and they would go off to a closet where there are a lot of clothing. But interestingly, what we found to be true was that the way kids were getting the lighters, parents would say, oh yes, my child showed an interest in this lighter, so I stuck it in an upper cabinet. Well, children would push chairs over to the counter, and they would climb and they would get it off the top of the cabinet. And afterwards, parents would be asked, well, do you know your child can climb? We're talking about 2- and 3-year-old children. They'd say yes. Do you know your child can push a chair and climb on a chair? Yes, but there's a cognitive disconnect. They were not connecting this to what they consider to be a utilitarian tool. Another thing we know about how consumers store things is that often they'll leave things like big toys, like we have these little, like, what do you call it, little Tykes bike, like a big wheels bike, you know, with the big wheels. You can't keep it in the house, it's too big. It's a big plastic for toddlers bike. So people would keep it in a shed or a garage outside of the house, which also happens to be where they were storing their gasoline. And in moving the little bike out, the children would knock over the gasoline, it would start a horrific fire. So we know that this is another issue in terms of how consumers walk away from consumer products, and that's why child-resistant features are best, and we're working on those with gas cans and kerosene cans now. So I said that one thing we wanted to look at was how to identify use behaviors, and the other thing is how do we identify hazardous components? And I want to talk about something called anthropometry data. Anthropometry is the scientific study of the measurements of different body parts and body proportions. And it actually, this field got started hundreds of years ago, and they used to measure body parts and try to figure out who was a criminal based on how close their eyes were set and the size and shape of their head. So we've advanced a little bit beyond that. And let me talk about different types of anthropometric measurements and how we use those to prevent injuries. So this is just a standard picture, and you can see we've got different types of static anthropometry measurements when the body is standing still like this. So we do height and weight, we do seated height, we do diameter, you know, wrist circumference, things like that. And this type of information is very helpful for when you're designing a product to make sure that product is going to fit on the consumer's body, right? So you want to make sure that that watch has the holes in the right places so it's not too big and it's not too small. But we also use it to avoid entrapment, the retention of fingers and hands, feet, and heads in openings. This is a finger that got caught in a child's toy. This is a hand that got caught. One of the big problems we had many, many years ago before the CPSC came out with its playground standards, requirements, was children would get their heads caught in between the rungs, let me go back to this one, of the ladder. So what they would do is they would climb up and they'd see something in the grass. And so they'd get back down and the rungs are like this. And looking forward, they knew they had to turn their head to put their head in, and then they'd turn it down and see it in the grass, and they'd pull their head back out, but they wouldn't know to turn it to the side. And so they'd be pulling out, and you'd think, well, at least their legs are on the ground, their feet are on the ground to support their body. That doesn't help. The weight of the head over the bar, your neck can only hold your head up for so long, and they would strangle. And we see another problem, and we still see this problem because model building codes in the United States aren't uniform and they don't account for this, where kids, you can go on YouTube and see this, it's so sad. Kids will get their heads stuck in banisters. And here's the reason. When you put your head through, like this, but when you pull your head back out, your ears get stuck. And so the kids, again, are screaming. I just watched another video of this last week. Very sad. And this is a product that was recently recalled because heads fit inside the little hole in the top of the table. So anthropometry data used to only focus on static measurements, but it's expanded over the years, and now we have a lot of studies on strength capabilities. And these are dynamic measurements, and these include things like the strength of the arms, the hands, legs, fingers, gross motor behaviors like pushing, pulling, and lifting, and fine motor behaviors, and even things like biting. And you can see the fine motor behaviors like wrist twisting, pinching, gripping, squeezing, biting, lip strength. So we use positively the strength data to make sure that people can access products that they want to access. But we also use it to exclude use by children. So that's what the child caps are for, battery compartments that are child resistant. And here you see a latch which exceeds the reach capability of a child, but also the hand capabilities of that child. So there's a couple things to consider when you're applying anthropometry data. First, you have to be aware of human variability. And what that means is there's inconsistency within an age group. These three children are the same age. The two ends are twins, and you can see that there are big differences in height. The other thing, of course, there are sex differences. Puberty accounts for some of that. And also there are inconsistencies within a person's body. Sometimes you see somebody with a gigantic head and really little ears. So you can't just apply the anthropometry data generally speaking. It has to be very specific. And there are cultural differences as well. There are some regions of the world where people have smaller stature and people have larger stature, so it's important to consider the source where the anthropometry study was done in order to apply that data. There's also potentially confounding factors. I always say that anytime you read a study, you have to review the methodology and you have to decide for yourself, is it a good study? Because there are some studies that have poor methodologies that are published. So one thing with the subject, posture can account for, obviously, for seated height and standing height. And also effort. Motivation can be a factor when you're doing the dynamic measurements like squeezing and biting and pushing and pulling. And some of that just depends on the time of the day, if the child is hungry or what kind of mood the child is in. It also can depend on the tester. What kind of training has the tester had? Because some do a better job with giving instructions than others. And also, some are better at reading out the devices than others. It's also important within an anthropometry study, if possible, to use one tester so that you don't have different people with different directions and that sort of thing. So when in my talk it said that I was going to talk about how we identify hazards, how we try to identify hazards in advance, but also how do we address hazards. How we address hazards is very, very straightforward. We try to follow the safety hierarchy. The safety hierarchy is a systematic methodology for determining how you should address inherent product hazards. It's been around since the 1950s, and it's something that the CPSC utilizes. According to the safety hierarchy, whenever possible, you want to first eliminate the hazard from the design entirely. Here you can see a child's outer garment that has long strings. We had a problem with strangulation on long strings. Sometimes children, the end of the string, which might have a toggle on it, would get caught in a seam of playground equipment, or it would get caught in the handle of a school bus or a car door, and kids would get strangled. And so we have a standard that says you cannot have long strings at the head and neck of children's outerwear. It's completely eliminated. Sometimes you cannot eliminate the source of the hazard. So we block or guard against it. Here's an example. This is the example I wanted to give, which the lighter. You cannot take the flame out of a lighter and still have a fire, right? You need the flame. The problem was children were climbing to access the lighters, so we put a child-resistant mechanism on it's required now on lighters and barbecue lighters. And here we have a great one. This is a design that's to prevent adults from injuring themselves. On food processors, if like carrots are in there and they jam up and people would stick their fingers in, the lid on the food processor will not, unless the lid is locked into place, the blades will not turn. So this is a great mechanism to help adults with safety. And then, of course, we have irons and coffee makers that have automatic shutoff devices. The very, very last thing you want to do is warn. So the first thing is eliminate the hazard. If you can't do that, then you block it out, you guard or shield against it. And if you really think that product deserves a place in the market and you can't figure out a way to get rid of the hazard through the design, you warn about it. It's usually not very effective based on the research. And there are a number of reasons. First, we know that even very large and conspicuous warnings are often overlooked, and that's usually because the person's not interacting with that product. We also know that consumers typically will not look for or notice warnings on familiar household products. These household products become part of the visual landscape. They don't even notice them. We have a problem with window blind strangulation. We've had that problem since 1983. At least one child dies every month from strangling on window blind cords. And there's a warning. It's on the very bottom rail, the very bottom slat, but people aren't looking for that warning. And so it's been ineffective. The other thing we know is that high cost reduces compliance. If you have a warning, like on dryers, we have a problem with dryer fires in the United States. And the reason that we have dryer fires is because of lint that's getting caught inside the dryer someplace. Well, we know that most people clean the lint out of that lint catcher right there at the top. But the instructions also tell you, pull the dryer out, vacuum inside the back of the dryer, and vacuum inside the wall. And after you're done with that, go outside and vacuum the vent outside. And people aren't doing that. And the reason is because of the high cost. High cost means not just do you need to lay out money to comply with the warning, but inconvenience, time, tools, and there are a lot of other things that can be included as high cost. Another thing we know is warnings cannot overcome intuitive use. This is a generator being used inside the house. The warnings on the generator say, do not bring that generator in the house. And the warnings also say, do not let this generator get wet. And the only reason you need a generator is if it's really snowing, or if it's really raining, or if there's ice, and those things are wet. So people bring them inside. And the other thing is, consumers who spend the money on this, who live in low-income areas, are afraid someone will take their generator. They'll just unplug it and take it to their house. So warnings can't overcome the way a person thinks that they need to use that product. We also know that warnings cannot overcome product affordances. This sign says, do not climb and play on the pipe. The pipe is in the middle of a swimming area. And just so that you know what product affordances are, a product affordance is what does the product afford or allow you to do with it. I gave the example earlier of a chair. You can sit on it, you can also stand on it. Here's a pipe, you can play on it. So you can't warn around product affordances. The bottom line is warnings are not a substitute for safe product design. This says, caution, gumballs and bouncing balls are mixed together. Really? That's ridiculous. So I want to thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, I don't know that I have time for questions, but you can see me after the break, okay?